have a great panel. I would like to invite all our panelists and then introduce them. Ivy, Mas, Shirin, and Ilora, please come and join me. Yeah. So let me give you a little bit before this talk. It is. It's blinding. So basically, the way... can you just lower the light up? Audience light is fine. Stage light, please. Stage light. Okay, this is perfect. So before I introduce our panelists, may I have your attention, please? Okay. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I think many of ours. And I would invite all of you to listen to this conversation, because I think this is one of the great opportunity to have this intergenerational conversation here. And I see many of my students and young colleagues here. So today, we actually started this conversation, beginning of this panel was that everywhere we see in the world there's a crisis mode, right? There's a crisis, whether it's in Iran, whether in America, abortion right, whether in Bangladesh, everywhere there's a crisis, and there's always women. Women are always fighting. So we were thinking whether there was any right moment or a good moment we ever had where we had some respite, or what has happened over the past few decades that brought us here today. So, and how our sisters from different platforms tried to negotiate their way, made their path, paved our path, and the giants, those are sitting here, and we are still standing on their shoulder and claiming our space. So this is where we are starting. I will introduce Ivy Nalama Josiah. She's a veteran human rights advocate and gender consultant and trainer. Former president and executive director of Women Aid Organization, WOW, and she has been working for more than 20 years, developing shelter services, advocacy strategies, and law and policy reform. Then we have Masjaliza Hamza. She is an industrial engineer, but she moved to journalism, and she was with Sisters in Islam for the longest period of time, and she has contributed to all major democratic movement in Malaysia. So we have two sisters here. Third is our very own and very beloved comrade, Shirin Parveen Haq. She is a women's rights activist working on gender, human rights, and development. She's the founder member of NariPokho, as many of you know already, where she has worked and volunteered since the 1983. She's currently ordinary coordinator of NariPokho's program, Standing with Rohingya Women, is also a member of NariPokho Working Group on Women's Sexual and Reproductive Rights, Forgotten Women in 1971, War Children 1971. And she is also the founder of Maulik Odhikar Surakha Committee for the Protection of Fundamental Rights. And finally, we have our sister, Ilora Shehabuddin, literally. And she's a professor of gender and women's studies and global studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She has received her PhD from Princeton University. Her book, the recent book is so relevant to us, is The Sister in the Mirror, A History of Muslim Women and Global Politics of Feminism. She also wrote about reshaping the holy democracy development Muslim women in Bangladesh. So I do have some set questions, so we will start with that, and then we'll see how it goes, and then we'll be taking questions from you. So the first question, as we started, was this whole defining mood of the discussion was crisis, or this alarm bell that something is going off all the time. How do we move beyond this language of perpetual crisis and place ourselves in long tradition of struggle? So this question is to Ivy, and I would ask everyone to respond to the question. I have 3 questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe we stuck in one question forever.
No.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the invitation, Sadat and Dhaka Big Fest. Okay, occasionally you may see me put down my shades, not because my future is so bright, but I really cannot see. My actual glasses, spectacles broke, so this is prescriptive, so I may bring it down so I can see who's out there. So, Shruti, as you said, I've been working on domestic violence for years, for 30, 40 years in fact, and I'm still working on, I used to run a shelter and I'm still very involved in the shelter movement. So I'm used to crisis. The women's movement in Malaysia, and especially women who are working on domestic violence, we're used to the word crisis. It doesn't scare us. You know, so on a personal level, in the middle of the night, you need to rescue a woman, she needs medical attention, she may have to be hidden from her perpetrator, she may have to be even transported to another state or even to another country because it's a crisis situation, because if the husband finds her, he might kill her. So we are used to crisis. But we're not in a crisis mode all the time, even as we are helping individual women resolve their crisis with what's known as a crisis intervention strategy. We're already thinking long term. We're already thinking, what law do we need? What protection do we need? What systems need to be changed? How attitudes have to be changed so we no longer. I used to say when I was the head of the shelter, the day we close down the shelter, then we are really successful. That means we do not need a shelter anymore. But sadly, it's not the case. So we are used to being in a crisis mode, and we are constantly looking at the crisis and planning ahead. I mean, Shireen knows this. You know, because violence against women was the global women's movement in the 80s. It was violence, and we already started doing taking all kinds of initiatives to make sure institutional changes take place. So we're not in a victim mode. We're not even in a survivor mode. We're in a superwoman mode. We've learned that from the movement. So enough said. So crisis is fine. We will handle it, and you know what? We're going to go beyond it. We can handle crisis. Women, we handle crisis very well.
Thank you. Mas.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think the introduction was like a bit too high for me. I feel like I sort of joined, if that's such a word that could be used, the women's movement in Malaysia much later, and also in an indirect way. I was a journalist and started interviewing women activists, including Shireen when she came to Malaysia. So in that sense, and I also have had my fingers in various pies, you know, like other democratic movements like electoral reform, etc. and all that. So I think the whole idea of crisis is good, because with crisis comes opportunity. I mean, that's not new. You know, people always say that. But I think we also have to shift the way we look at things as well, and how we respond. Because if we are always responding to crisis, and we define it as crisis, then our response is also quite a bit more dramatic, right? It's firefighting. And I think there's also a tendency to also be in fighting mode. And there may come a point in time when that kind of response may not always be useful. I sort of reflect on the situation in Malaysia, where we had a change of government, a shift in terms of our political landscape, in terms of the future of our country, where in 2018 we had a government that was in power for more than 6 decades got, changed to a different one. And I felt like, I don't know if this is, I don't think it's peculiar to, and maybe it doesn't even apply as much to the women's movement, but to the other groups that are operating, the human rights movement, etc. in Malaysia. I felt like we were in crisis mode for a while, and it took us a bit of time to just make that shift in our head that this is an opportunity that we have, that there is a government that is, maybe a bit more pro-reform, a lot pro-reform, definitely compared to the previous one. And this is how do we engage with this government and not just fight? How do we make an impact? How do we put our voices in there and actually have policies that we've been fighting for the longest time in Chowting, for that to be able to be applied and made into laws and and all that. So I feel like so we need that shift in order to also help us frame our response to an issue. We can't just be in crisis mode and think of it as such. We need to say, okay, now is the time to seize it. This is an opportunity, and this is how we can make the changes that we want to make for the longest time that we've been fighting for. How do we put our foot there and make sure the door is open for us to make a huge impact when the opportunity presents itself?
Sure.
Okay. First of all, can we have the audience lights on? I feel like we're in a movie. Can we have the audience lights on?
Audience light.
That's better.
Lighting in front.
What I want to say is, like Ivy and Mas, crisis is very much part of the women's movement, part of any movement actually. Movement for change is about dealing with crisis. I think for us in the women's movement, the struggle has been balance between firefighting and the more positive movement building activities. Because there's no way of escaping the firefighting. You have to do that. So it's a question of how do we balance between all the firefighting work that has to go on, you can't escape that, and all the sort of more longer term work we want to do. And I think in terms of the movement in Bangladesh, there have been some key points of crisis, which we can talk about. I think for us, Nari Pakkho, we were still very young at that time. In 1988, the declaration, or the announcement, not the declaration, the announcement to bring about an amendment, a proposed amendment to the constitution to introduce state religion, posed a kind of crisis because the women's movement was divided. And it was not divided along lines of opposing the amendment, but the strategy. So Nari Pakkho, being very young and not being totally aware of the problems that lay ahead, we decided that we wanted to be out there and oppose it in a big way. And our older sister organization, Mahila Parishad, did not feel that we should be doing that. So there was a little bit of a crisis then, which I think in a way became a positive, how should I say? It actually, maybe there was an unintended positive outcome, which meant that moment decided that the women's movement had to be autonomous. It was not going to deliver if we were allied to any particular political party or the other, or to even any particular social organization or the other. So that was a defining moment for the women's movement in Bangladesh, I think, that we had to be autonomous. And I think Mahila Parishad also gradually did become autonomous, even though it had its origins in being a sister organization to the Communist Party. It ultimately became an autonomous organization. So crisis actually, as you say, brings about opportunities for some major reflection and also then major decisions and strategies. So,
Hello.
So I'm the one who has the least experience on the ground. I'm surrounded by these serious activists. My perspective comes from looking at the women's movement in different contexts, historically and transnationally. I guess the only thing I would add is that we can also think of crisis. You mentioned the situation in the US, for example, regarding reproductive rights. You can think of crisis as a backlash. So it's because the women's movement has been so successful in many of these contexts that you have, right-wing forces and the government coming up with these strategies to push back. So I think that's one thing to think about when we think of these crises. And of course, as my colleagues have said, long term you have had things where you're fighting fires that pop up, murders, deaths, rape incidents that go unpunished. And of course everyone in power is complicit in these things, and we're not willing to talk about those in certain contexts. And that's when the women's movement has been braver than many other movements in coming out and speaking. I'm sure it's the same in Malaysia. So many groups will stay quiet because they don't want to ruffle feathers, but the women's movement has been very outspoken. So those crises emerge in these different moments, and then you have to fight those. But we can also agree that globally the women's movement has matured in a way that they are, as you've all said, thinking about the long term as they're fighting these individual little fires that pop up. I'll leave it there.
That brings us to the second question. I would take the lead both from Ivy and Hashim, as that of course we had the good moments and bad moments. So we are not always crisis driven, right? And many of us actually faced this ambivalent position when we had to negotiate with the state. Now, the way I understand women's movement is essentially it's located within a volatile political field where all these factors are working simultaneously. My second question is, when we think about these factors in the field where women's movement is located, what would you say has defined the kind of movement that we see on the ground, both in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, and in Korea, transnationally, where we are standing right now? And basically, this defining moments when it's not really the crisis that we want to see, but I think one of the things this panel is supposed to deliver is the hope to our younger generation as well. So the strength of those moments that you have fought before, those firefighting movement, and also long term, because many of them are coming from a very different platform, and they don't think like us, that's oldies, right? And we are watching, and I are part of this Feminists Across the Generation, the conversation space where we are constantly having conversation with the younger generation, and we see we have very different kinds of understanding of what the situation is. But the thing is, like, we are still building on the things that is already have been done. The path have been paved. So what are those moments, what are those strengths you would say like you're very proud of, or not really proud of, but the things that really meant something, that brought you here, and you still are, every day you are waking up, that wake up call, that I wake up and I'm still ready to fight the fight. So what would be those defining moments?
I think for me, two things. One is back in Malaysia would be getting a bill passed called the Domestic Violence Act, right? It took us about 11 years. And there was a defining moment in my country because it was said to us, first of all, Malaysian men do not beat their wives. When we started in 1985, when we began, they said, Malaysian men do not beat them. You're going to shut down the shelter. Then, over a period of 11 years, we were able to convince, because of the different multiple strategies, and this is what I find very empowering about the women movement, and their movements, not necessarily one movement, right? The way we engaged with, and sometimes even accidentally, right? Engaging with the media, where the media was already writing stories, engaging with allies in government, engaging with the public. Okay, that was one of the best achievements, when they were threatening not to implement people writing letters to the editor, engaging with Islamic authorities and the government who wanted us to go ahead and pass a Domestic Violence Act for non-Muslims, because Malaysia is made up of a majority Muslims and quite a sizable number of non-Muslims too. So it's a mixed, and there's personal laws for Muslim women, and we have civil laws for non-Muslim women. And they said, go ahead, pass the bill for non-Muslim women, and we said no. Again, a defining moment, because we are not going to leave our sisters behind. We're going to move, everyone must do this together. And it's one of the first booklets that came out of Sisters in Islam was, can a Muslim man beat his wife, right? Amazing that we actually came up with this book and nobody was jailed or burnt or whatever. We came up with it. So all of this came together, and this morning, while the speeches were being made, I was reflecting on that. All the different strategies that came together was amazing, right? And stop using the word amazing. It was really, it was important. And I think if I look at today, and there were many surprises. The women themselves, the women who came up with their stories. At the end of the day, the women who come and share their lived realities, not me, Ivy Josiah, who's middle class, who may have not have been beaten by, physically by a man, but definitely emotionally. But telling the story doesn't seem real. But when women come from all different backgrounds, come and tell their story, then the lived realities of women are the most important ingredient. It's not even a strategy, the reality, the most important strategy or ingredient needed, because the women are real. So, in a crisis moment like Afghanistan, right? And for me, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this a bit. When women were told they can no longer go to university, the men walked out of the universities, right? Now, because someone's going to ask me about what is the role of men. Give up your entitlements. When men stand up to the patriarchy by giving up their entitlements, that for me, what a moment, right? What a great moment. So, I can go on and on about all the different, earlier on Mas was talking about the Me Too movement, which is also a defining moment, right? Oh no, I don't have
Okay. I thought the Me Too movement was something that wasn't just happening in the United States, but was impacting us women in many parts of the world. In Malaysia, I guess in a way, like, sorry?
young women.
Yeah, young women especially, because they are on social media a lot, and that's almost the platform with which a lot of these cases were being discussed and shared and all that. So that, really helped women in Malaysia sort of respond to that. I want to also say, and that brings me to my point that I would like to mention. You mentioned, Shruti, you mentioned just now that in Bangladesh, that there are conversations between older generation feminists with younger generation feminists. Not a big, okay. Because I wanted to say that because I feel like we also need to have that in Malaysia probably. And especially now with, previously, women's movements, different organizations that work on women's rights issues, we meet, there is a network of all these different groups, so we talk to each other, and within each organization there are older feminists and younger feminists, for the lack of a better way to describe it, and there's conversations among that, but with Me Too, I think there's probably like a whole batch of younger women who are activists, who are very active on social media, who may not be connected to these more established groups and networks. So maybe the connection is actually being made in Malaysia, but perhaps we could think around having more, for the lack of a better word, organized. I don't know, but sometimes people, in this day and age, people say a lot of things are like organic and it just explodes and people latch onto that, right? But if we could have more organized talks occasionally between younger activists, younger feminist activists, and older activists, so there isn't this, and I've heard this quite a bit in Malaysia, there isn't this like Zoomer versus Boomer kind of mentality, because it doesn't help us, right? It doesn't help us at all when that age, you know, I feel like it's imaginary in a way. It's cleaved through. That you shouldn't do that, because what we can do is that we can learn from each other, and at some point you need to graduate from social media to actually meeting in real life, because often even when we talk about like you know, during the pandemic where people are connected via Zoom and all that, at the end of the day we do crave this human connection and meeting with other people and engaging and talking and being inspired in person, listening to their stories while talking to each other. So I think that's very important, and that's a conversation and you know, an action that maybe we can do a lot more in Malaysia.
Thank you. I just want to clarify the small conversation that we're talking about. I think all these organizations have matured, whether it's Mahila Parishad, it's Nari Bokho, Angelic Kendra, or Blast, or anyone who's working on rights, and especially women's rights. They are also aware that leadership is aging, right? Also, there's a need from within to have that conversation, but also there are strategic alliances based on different issues. So, and the thing is, like, we also need to understand that there's a massive shift in the kind of politics that we believe in. One was ideologically led, now it's more transversal, where we are aligned together based on certain kind of issues. Those are the issues. There are at least two issues, Shirin, if I remember correctly. There are different organizations, the newer and the older, actually worked together hand in hand. So those are like this very small, but I think there's a felt need from within that we need to have that. And I see a lot of young leadership in Nari Bokho, young leadership in Mahila Parishad organizations that I'm part of. Yeah, there's this inertia where you are having this conversation, where you are open to have those conversations. And I also think, it's not only the keyboard warrior who are fighting, but they are also ready to come on to the street. And there are small feminist groups which are not typical organizations like me or this Ogni, I think Ogni was there. So there are small and of course feminists across generation. So these are small groups who are also younger ones who are trying to reach out, and those movement is here. That is something that I wanted to add. The moment, the key moment.
I think for Nari Bokho, in a 40-year journey, there are at least a dozen key moments, but I'll talk about two. I think for us, a very important and key moment was the aligning ourselves with the struggle of sex workers in Bangladesh.
Yes.
Because that was a challenge at many levels. It was a challenge about class. Many women activists of Mahila Parishad or Women Lawyers Association or many of the organizations found it very difficult to actually sit at the same table with sex workers. And it was a class issue, but B, it was also the issue about sex work is something like untouchability. So, it had the same kind of connotation like untouchability. So how can we sit at the same table? How can we even have tea together? So that was the level of challenge to align with the struggle of sex workers. But we were not deterred by that, and we went ahead. And I think it was a major learning and a major gain for Nari Bokho itself. We learned a lot from the struggle of sex workers. What made us align with their struggle was the first press release they issued when one of the major brothels in Tanbazar, in a neighboring town, not far from Dhaka, was evicted very early in the morning. At 5 in the morning, the entire brothel was evicted. Many of the women with children had nowhere to go. Within a few hours, the Nari Pakha office had been turned into an impromptu shelter. And there were like 40 women sleeping in the Nari Pakha office. And we took turns to be there, so that if there was any problem, there would be at least one of us to face that. But in that time, we not only made an acquaintance with sex workers, the women who were sex workers. We also learned about not only their lives, they also wanted to know about our lives. I mean, I think one very famous conversation is, how often do you have sex? Most of the Nari Pakha women were going, hi.
What's that again?
Yeah. So
Like riding a bicycle.
so there was a lot to learn. But I think the important thing was that we actually were able to overcome many boundaries, both ways. And this was very important for the women in Nari Pakha. It was also very important for the media. And the campaign that the media undertook on behalf of us and the sex workers was phenomenal. For a whole month, it was front page in the major newspapers. And forever, the word prostitute in Bengali, Besha or Potita, has gone out of the media. The word that is used now is Jono Kurmi, sex worker. So this was the major thing. And so that stands out as a key moment for us. And the other one, I think, is our attempt to form a national network of women's organizations. We have been very clear from the very beginning that we can form issue-based alliances. Very difficult to have coalitions. Coalitions are like marriages. And women, as women, we are very wary about marriage. So we decided from very early on, we will enter into alliances, but stay away from coalitions. And that actually made a lot of our sisters in Mohila Parishad angry with us because we refused to join the alliance, the coalitions. But we said we will fight on the same issue as an alliance. And which we did, and I think we've been forgiven also for that. So this was a very important distinction that we had to make, and I think this distinction is actually applicable across movements, not just the women's movement. The whole issue, making a distinction between an alliance and coalitions. And I still find that a lot of people want to enter very hastily into coalitions without having worked through the debate, without having debated all the issues, hastily entering into coalitions and then falling apart. And that leaves a lot of bitterness and a lot of bad taste, yes. So we have been on a number of alliances with many organizations, but the one we have tried to develop is the National Network of Women's Organizations, which we named at one point Durbar. And this network came out of a national conference which was held before Beijing as a kind of preparations for Beijing. And this national conference was preceded by 8 regional workshops identifying what are the key issues for women in Bangladesh. So when we finally went to the national conference, which was a 3-day conference, at the end of 3 days, the women who had come from all over the country said, well, we can't just go away. We need to be in touch. And of course, this is pre-digital era, at least in Bangladesh, 95 was still pre-digital. So how to do that? So that's how we actually ended up forming Durbar Network. And Durbar Network has been a very vital kind of aid to the women's movement, in the sense that if we decide that we want to protest a particular issue or a particular incident, we are able to make it nationwide within 48 hours. Because of, and so we have the same protests on the same day, not necessarily at the same time, but on the same day in at least 530 places. That's 530 organizations for the members. So this is please a high point also.
I guess on the global scale, since I won't speak to the specifics covered here, I won't speak to the specifics that have already been covered. On the global scale, I think the big accomplishment, historically speaking, also similar, parallel to what you said about the change in the relationship with the sex workers, is, you know, Western feminists coming, we'd like to think, to treat third world feminists as equal. So they're not saving us, but working alongside us, right? And letting us identify our problems here, and then seeing and providing allyship where needed. So I think that's been one of the big accomplishments. And even before you mentioned Beijing, I was thinking one of the big accomplishments of the middle part of the 20th century were the UN conferences. And if you trace their history, the first ones were based in the West, attended mostly by people in the West, but then you had the one in Mexico City, yes, but even there it was mostly North Americans who were able to come, yeah. But before Beijing, Africa, there was one in Nairobi, thank you. Nairobi, right? And Nairobi was a big one because there were more people from the developing world, or the third world, or the South, global South, than from the North. And I think that's when the Western feminists realized the power of the global South, which I think is really important. So I was thinking, well, since Beijing, we haven't had a global conference of that sort, but now we do have social media. We were discussing earlier how social media has, for all its problems, allowed this kind of global transnational networking to happen. So you mentioned earlier when we were discussing, right, you hear about the problems in Iran, and feminists from around the world can send in, you know, a more nuanced perspective and support. So I think that's been one of the big changes that we should be proud of, is these, you know, with the help of technology, with the passing of time, with the maturation of movements in all these different contexts. So it's a different perspective. Thank you.
Okay, this brings us to the last question, and because we want to hear from the audience as well. So this is a really short one, because I think all of you already know the answer. Is that how do we resist the temptation of reinventing the wheel and actually make a meaningful alliance with the younger generation? How do we do that? How are you doing it?
Explain the first part of the question.
This temptation of reinventing the wheels. Basically, when we are talking about the policy, we go back to the older story and not really understanding or not really recognizing the new realities of our time, and that how time has changed and how our work has changed, and the long-term goal that we are making, considering the new realities that has happened. So imagine the way you used to work in 80s and 90s, you don't work like that anymore, right? But what would you say is the most, the most effective way to build a bridge with the younger generation, in your eyes?
First of all, I think it's okay for the younger generation to think, oh my God, I can't stand that boomer, or boomers are terrible. And it's okay for us also to say, we don't understand, you're irritating me. It's okay to say that, because these are human feelings. It doesn't mean that if we get irritated with each other or frustrated with each other, we need to stop working. Because when we were younger, like you were saying earlier part, when Nori Papo first came up, or WAO first came up, the older National Council of Women were irritated with us. Who are these young people? So there will always be that. I don't think we thought about, let's reach out to young people, because younger people are now in women's groups, and the older women are also still in women's groups. We work together and we form coalitions. So one of the ways is working together. So in a working group, there'll be young people and old people. Though we didn't think about it, but I suddenly realized, since you asked the question, from a 60-year-old to a 23-year-old, we all are working in the same, and we work very well together. And let me demonstrate one thing we did in 2021. I hate reinventing the wheel. I mean, I'm always looking at ways. After I retired from full-time work, I'm always trying to think of different ways of doing it, but different ways of doing it. So in 2021, as I said, women's stories are very important. The telling of women's stories, which we had kind of forgotten, because we were also sophisticated in writing a very good memorandum, coming up with arguments, pages and pages of the law, and it's all quite intellectual. And what was missing there was the voices. We had to be reminded, this is actually real. A migrant worker who gets abused in Malaysia and trafficked is real. You know, the transgender woman who is getting abused and exploited and even raped by the authorities is real. So what I suggested to the women's groups, let's do a women's tribunal, but online, because remember it was COVID. The women's tribunal is nothing new. Both Shireen and I have been involved in this, and we were, you were in Vienna, weren't you? I wasn't, but I think, yeah, anyway. So the tribunal modality is nothing new. Women come up, they tell stories, and sometimes I know at both Shireen and I sometimes lamented, the stories are told and everybody's crying, we didn't want this victim mode. But we learned from that. So we did an online tribunal where we got 27, or was it 42, I can't remember. Anyway, see that memory, sorry. So we got women telling their stories in a tribunal. We had 4 judges, a judge as old as nearing 80, and the youngest judge was 27. We tried to make sure the judges came from different, what's the word for it? Of different ages. So we did a women's tribunal online. It was highly organized. The technology was almost going to defeat us, but we did well, and it went regionally. But not only was it in Malaysia. So old idea, but new technology. So that's okay. But what is the strategy that there's a constant there? Women's stories and analysis after that. There wasn't a dry eyes in the room. Is that right? Dry eyes. Okay. I get all my imagery mixed up. But it was not only just storytelling. It was storytelling and then analysis and recommendations. And every time we come up with lovely recommendations, very well, and in a very implementable way. I always pointed out to the minister or whoever, this is your national policy on women. So yeah, long story. It's okay to reinvent the wheel, but keep in mind the technology and the different ways of communicating and getting more people involved.
I think sometimes, so maybe, I hope this answers the question in an indirect way. I think often nowadays when there is a question to be asked and when there is a difference of opinion, especially if the discussion is on social media platforms, let's not just argue on social media and shout each other down on social media, but let's take that to meeting in person and discussing about it. Because I think often, an issue comes up, someone will comment something, this person, and then tag that person, then, it doesn't make us understand the issue and each other's nuanced positions more. It doesn't. It really just like puts people in different boxes, and if they don't fit that, then they are not one of us. Yeah. So I think that if there's anything that I think we need to work on, is for us to make that shift from just talking on ether and to make that to talking in person and meeting more, so we can discuss and understand each other's position much better. So after that we can hug and have a really nice tea or coffee.
I think what I want to talk about is the issue of death penalty and how that also divides our movements. There is a tendency in Bangladesh not only in the women's movement, that whenever there's a very egregious violation, people react and say, "Phashi chai, which means we want death." Yeah, demand for capital punishment. Now, to me, the way I see it is, it's because people don't have faith that justice will be delivered by the courts, because of corruption, because of influence, because of political maneuverings, whatever. So that is partly why people say, you know, we want hanging, because the courts will not deliver justice. But it's difficult to say, to get across, and this is largely young people. We are talking about young and old. This is largely young people, and I'm so disappointed that young people are actually driving the demand for death penalty in this country. And so we have to often take very unpopular stands. And one unpopular stand is to say, no, we will not support death penalty, no matter how egregious the crime is, no matter how brutal that gang rape was, but I will still not support death penalty. So these are kind of very contentious issues that need to be discussed in an environment of healthy debate. But then this becomes very difficult because it's very acrimonious, and people immediately kind of, you know, get their backs up, like, and there's no discussion. I'm aware of a very good piece of research which has been done on analyzing judgments where the death penalty was given. And this has been done by some very brilliant lawyers. They are afraid to release that publication because it's such a contentious issue, because it has also been tied up with the whole trial of war criminals. And so that is again, you know, sort of sacred area. You can't speak anything about it if they want to criticize it. Anybody who has criticized it has been slapped with contempt of court, including myself. And so this is an area. What I'm saying is that even within the women's movement, I find personally myself and many of my colleagues in Naripoka find that we are no longer only talking about the violation of women's rights or the violence that women face, but about fundamental rights of all citizens. And this is where a lot of our attention has shifted. And it has to do also with the current regime, where, you know, rights have been violated beyond anything we have seen since our independence. So it says, you know, women's organizations have to also respond to political realities. So
Women's organizations have always all political, and they have to. And they have to.
Intersectional feminism, where
Yes.
we are involved everywhere, whether it's climate,
Yeah.
whether you're in parliament, whether in a brothel, we're everywhere. Economics, there's always a gender perspective and women driving it. This is the success of the women movements.
but I'll tell you one thing, when we actually stood up against the introduction of state religion, and we said we believe in a secular state, which means separation of state and religion. Unfortunately, secularism is understood differently in our constitution. But anyway, we were told, why don't you stick to women's issues?
Yeah.
So, you know, women are citizens.
Ilera asked for from the panel, and then we'll open the floor to the audience.
So I'll just send out some provocations, as they say. I think Sheinapa and Irene just touched on this. I think a lot of this has to do with how we understand the meaning of feminism, right? So if you think it's only about women's issues, then you can see, so I don't have the luxury of saying, I'm constantly dealing with 18-year-olds as they enter college, right? So constantly having to say, you know, who considers themselves a feminist and why not? So that conversation happens every year, and they seem to be getting younger and younger, and you know, I'm here. So that conversation constantly happens, and what's interesting to see is that feminism is somehow only being about, in the US context where I teach, the wage gap between men and women. Then they'll say, well, you know, it's much better than it used to be. We're not all we're not quite there yet, but we've come a long way. The real problems are in other countries, right? So then you have to unpack the meaning of feminism to show them that it's actually much broader. The clothes you're wearing, check the label. Where is it made? Where is it coming from? How are you complicit in the labor conditions in those other places, which of course is a very often Bangladesh and other places. So thinking of feminism broadly as something that concerns all these other areas that my colleagues talked about means that you have to realize that you end up realizing that many of these things are yet to be resolved. It's not simply about the wage gap. It's not simply about, also whatever the narrowest definitions you can think of, not coming to me right now. So if you think of feminism as defined as representing the historically marginalized voices in any context, then the fight remains relevant, right? No matter what, in any context, whether in the more successful, wealthier countries or in our poorer countries in the global south. So that's, I think, something we need to be very aware of, that feminism is not simply about women's rights, because women don't exist in a vacuum. So you always have to think about the bigger picture.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Now, we only have 10 minutes, and we want to wrap it on time. And people from the next panel, our time was eaten up by the previous panel, so we apologize for the delay. Yes, I see Mashayek's hand, and yeah.
So head here.
Yeah.
You see,
Yes. Yeah. Can we just? Yeah. Oh no. Somebody else. Yes. Yes. No. From the back first. Yeah. Is it on there? Yeah.
Do I start first? All right, I'll go first. Nasser was saying, I was born here, studied here. I live in Los Angeles right now, so coming here to watch you guys was an absolute pleasure. So I consider myself a feminist. I grew up in a family with 3 extremely talented females, my 3 sisters and my mom, who actually brought me up, and now I'm in a family where I also have another woman, very dynamic, my woman, which is my wife, kind of raising me. So I had a quick question for all of you guys, which is, how do you encourage young people, very progressive young people, to apply real politics, right? And actually change the status quo from within through the annals of politics. So one of the arguments against young people is they're not very politically motivated, right? So even in the US, people say people who are activists don't go and vote, or people who are activists don't become senators or Republicans or are in that already. So how do you encourage people in Bangladesh to actually apply the disciplines of real politics and also disciplines of Machiavellianism to actually change it from within?
Okay, let's stick to one question. Let's not elaborate. So, do you want to? Yeah, you collect the questions. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Antara.
So my question is about the way forward of the feminist movement, specifically in Bangladesh. So I think it's very sad. Sorry. So my question is about the way forward of the feminist movement in Bangladesh, specifically in Bangladesh. I think that the current movement, especially from more veteran, experienced feminists, use a lot of very old methods that are often not palatable to the younger generation. So things like press releases, press conferences, and etc. And the point of me saying this is just that that is still relevant to a certain group of people in Bangladesh and not to others. So that, and secondly, that all feminist work seems to happen through NGOs. So how can this movement include more everyday voices and more everyday people, especially from the young people, if NGOs and those older methods are what we're sticking to?
Mine is a more personal one. Most of my girlfriends that I hang out with, they're pretty much an inspiration themselves. And as a teacher, even in my class, I noticed that the girls are being more aware and learning themselves, and most of my guy friends or the students that I observe, they make sexist jokes and stuff. It only comes from mostly men. So I feel like we overeducated girls already, and they're very aware and they're learning. So how can we make that for the male version as well, to educate them into the same level?
Okay, two more. He was standing there first, yes.
So I wanted to ask about. Hi. I'm Avir. I grew up in Bangladesh. I currently go to school in Los Angeles. I wanted to ask about including women who are not so privileged in the conversation. I believe Elora talked about the importance of the Global South, and obviously we've seen examples of that in the past in Chile, for example. In Bangladesh, obviously this discussion, this room that we're in, everybody is quite educated and I would say relatively wealthy. So how do we go forward in including women who are not as privileged, not as being able to access discussions like this? How do we bring the conversation to them?
This is the last question. We can't take any more questions because we really need to wrap up in 5 minutes. So, whoever wants to. Anyone?
Okay, very quick questions. Number one, I'm a little. Why is it we always ask the women's groups how to change men? So, I really would like to know from the men themselves, how can we change you? I mean, how can you change yourself? So you are changed. You say you are a feminist man. Good, great, welcome. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's awesome being a feminist. Please, so try and get from men together and figure out how we can change. Don't ask us to bring about it. Just we are solving problems. Number one. Number two, to get young people more involved in activism, I can just tell you one program that I'm involved in ASEAN. In ASEAN is Southeast Asia, ASEAN. So what we do is we have programs where we run workshops for young people to become change makers. So we don't use the word activists. They're called change makers. So you could be like, you want to learn to clean a river. Perhaps you want to promote period poverty. So young people just compete. They come to a workshop and your best projects, and they come up with a plan, and your best projects get funded. Keyword, they get funded. What we do in the program is, and this is where I come in and my friends come in, we're subversive. We introduce feminism, we introduce racism, we introduce politics into the program while talking about how to become a change maker. Whatever project you're doing, this whole thing about don't leave no one behind, intersectional approach. So there are actual programs on the ground in Southeast Asia, and it's not run by women's groups, it's run by embassies, it's run by groups that innovate. There are many programs like that in Malaysia, within Southeast Asia. 1, 2, 3, what was the last one? That's it, I think. That's it, I think. I can't think. There was one more thing. And young people also, please talk among yourselves. How can you get involved? Give us some ideas and create your own programs. We'll be there to support you.
Yeah, take ownership, the young people's movement. It's very hard to think with these bright lights, but what I wanted to say, two things that came to me. Even in the US, we recognize, and this is one of the things I point out in my first day's lecture of the Intro Women's Studies class, is that women have, I think this goes to your point, women have gotten much better about going out and being 50% of the workforce. Many, even in Dhaka, right? Women are working in far greater numbers than before. What hasn't happened is men picking up housework, right? So it's women doing double duty, working outside and then coming home, and that hasn't changed in any place in the world. So women are doing double duty because men haven't progressed. So the example that some authors have given is, in the US at least, there's something called Take Your Daughter to Work Day. And that's done, and everyone takes their daughter to work to show them the workplace and how to be a professional person. What you don't have is teach your son to be a caregiver, or teach your son to change a diaper, the equivalent. So I think that needs to be done, we still let men get away with a great deal. Something will come back to me. Go ahead.
I just want, I have just very little to add. I want to say that one way that has happened in Malaysia is that when women, okay, a lot of young women are on social media. So what has happened is that conversations are happening on social media in terms of like Twitter Space, etc. and all that. So one way with which to engage with more younger people would be to go to spaces where younger people hang out. That's just my little addition to this panel.
I don't have anything to add. I think that's been answered. What I would like to do is take half a minute.
Last sec. One last sec. Yeah. There's a poster.
Okay, this is our first poster. 1987. I'm a woman, the whole world is my battlefield. And this poster stands till today. So, okay, the next one is on the movement against violence against women. This was 1993 from Vienna. And basically it says, for thousands of years you have tried to silence me in the name of religion, motherhood and culture. You have robbed me of my human dignity. Don't you raise those hands of violence again. Freedom awaits. Last one is on 50 years of Bangladesh's independence to remind everyone of the women who have been forgotten. The Miranda.
Thanks everyone for joining us.